everyone. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm absolutely delighted and honored to welcome David Sorkin back to Brown as the BJS visiting scholar for 2016. You may have noticed I said welcome him back to Brown, because many of you may know that David began his teaching career at Brown in the mid-1980s. On the way here, he just mentioned to me it's exactly 30 years since he left Brown. The occasion of his being here has been commemorated in an iconic postcard that's still being sold at the bookstore at Brown. The postcard shows David conducting a seminar on the green, sitting cross-legged in the midst of a circle of students who are looking up at him expectantly. And that postcard has become kind of the image of Brown at its best. Since that idyllic portrait, David Sorkin has gone on to become one of the most distinguished and original practitioners of modern European and Jewish history of his whole generation, I think. He is currently the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Modern Jewish History at Yale University, and he's the author of 4 important monographs as well as several collections of important essays. These works of David's have fundamentally transformed the categories of modern Jewish historiography. Like his undergraduate mentor, George Mossy, David Sorkin asks big questions, focusing on issues defining moments in modern Jewish history and European history, which at certain points meet and get entangled. And it's these entanglements that David really is interested in. Despite their enormous scope, Sorkin's books are characteristically specific. They are enormously erudite. They have a sense of balance and fairness. And I think, very importantly, they also display an enormously lucid literary style. But if I were to seek for the reason for the transformative impact of David Sorkin on the profession, I would point to the originality of his work and his ability to challenge accepted orthodoxies in the profession. His first book was The Transformation of German Jewry, 1780-1840, which was published in 1987. It was the winner of the Prescott Tense Joel Caviar Literary Award for History. The book presents a bold reinterpretation of Jewish assimilation in 19th century Germany, arguing that German Jewish emancipation resulted not just in assimilation or integration, but rather in the creation of a new German Jewish subculture that used elements of the majority culture to create parallel but autonomous social institutions. And since the publication of that book, I can't tell you how often I have heard the use of the German Jewish subculture among historians of German Jewry. His second book was Moses Mendelsohn and the Religious Enlightenment. It was published in 1996. And this book presents an intriguing reinterpretation of the philosopher by focusing on his Hebrew texts deriving from Jewish religious thought and showing their complex interplay with the better-known German writings on Enlightenment that have been associated with Mendelsohn. His next book, which was originally conceived as a series of essays on the Berlin Haskalah, suggests that Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, was not simply a precursor of emancipation, as usually supposed, but also a self-generating movement of religious renewal whose roots can be traced back to the Jewish religious tradition. His latest and perhaps most ambitious book has been The Religious Enlightenment, Protestants, Jews, and Catholics from London to Vienna, and the book came out in 2008. This book presents a broad synthetic analysis of Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic Enlightenment ideas, which he places in the very center of Enlightenment in intellectual debates. His presentation at Brown will focus on another set of controversial issues, which is the meeting ground between Jewish emancipation and modern politics as invented by the French Revolution. The first of these lectures on this topic is entitled Were Jews Central to the French Revolution? A Contrarian Analysis. I'm very pleased and very happy to welcome you, David, back to that.
Thank you, Mary, for that extremely kind, generous, and as always characteristic of you, absolutely lucid introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at Brown. As Mary mentioned, it's been 30 years since I left. I'd like to thank the Judaic Studies program for the invitation to be the visiting scholar. Let me just say something about the shape of the two lectures and the seminar that I'm going to be giving this month. What I'm trying to do is to revisit the emancipation of the Jews in France, especially the two decrees of January 28, 1790 and September 27, 1791, by which the Jews gained equal rights in France. This was, of course, a momentous event. For the first time, Jews were now full citizens of a modern state. Looking across Europe, France seemed to be the model of a quick, painless, revolutionary grant of rights. In the German states, for example, debates about emancipation had begun in the 1780s, but equal rights were first attained, at least on paper, in 1870 with unification. In the Habsburg lands, the process had begun with Joseph II's multiple edicts of toleration for the various parts of the Habsburg Empire, but equality, on paper at least, was not achieved until the creation of the dual monarchy in 1867. Or in England, for example, full political rights weren't attained until 1858, when the first Jew, a Rothschild, was allowed to take the oath to become a member of parliament. In Russia, not until 1917. Now, many historians contrast France's revolutionary model of unconditional emancipation with the protracted, enlightened etatist, incrementalist model of conditional emancipation in Central Europe, not to mention a total lack of emancipation in Eastern Europe, which actually isn't true, but I won't talk about that today. But was the grant of rights, in France, in fact, quick and painless? Did it end in 1791? The purpose of my lectures in the seminar is to complicate our understanding of emancipation in France by restoring contingency and the accidents of history to what has become a mythic event. Emancipation was, in fact, neither quick nor painless, nor perhaps even revolutionary. In the first lecture today, I'll undertake a close examination of those two decrees of January 1790 and September 1791. In the second lecture, I'll try to present a new view of Napoleon's Assembly of Notables and Sanhedrin of 1806-1808 and the so-called infamous decrees, the discriminatory legislation Napoleon put in place for a decade from 1808 to 1818. In the seminar paper, I'll assert that aspects of emancipation continued in France down to 1870, especially if we take account of Algeria, rather just of metropolitan France, and of course, and reaching a high point in some respects with the foundation of the Alliance Israélite Universelle in 1860. So, to the lecture itself, was equality for the Jews central to the French Revolution? My topic then will be three events this evening: the famous debate of December 23rd, 1789, about the emancipation of the Jews, and then, as I've mentioned, the two votes of January 28, 1790, and September 27, 1791, when the French National Assembly granted Jews equality as citizens. Now, there's no doubt that the French Revolution was momentous for the Jews. The Jews and Jewish historians have been obsessed with the French Revolution ever since the initial debate of December 23, 1789, is eminently comprehensible since it represented a major transformation in the Jews' status. The eminent historian of the early 20th century, Shimon Dubnov, for example, saw this grant of citizenship as inaugurating the modern period in Jewish history. Yet we should not allow that obsession to beget misconceptions. In marked contrast to Jews and historians of the Jews, the French revolutionaries and historians of the French Revolution have not been equally obsessed with the Jews. For them, Jews were at best a minor moment in an enormously complex decade and a half of continuous tumult. To contend that for the revolutionaries, the French revolutionaries, the Jews were good to think, as Ronald Schechter has argued, and held some central place in the revolution, whether in principle or in practice, is perhaps comforting to Jews and Jewish historians who do not wish to be relegated to the margins of so crucial an event. It is, however, not empirically true. In the definitive proceedings of the National Assembly, the December 23, 1789 debate takes up all of 6 pages. The volume itself, for most of 1789, runs to some 900 pages. It was one brief evening session of debate. In contrast, for example, the Batavian Republic, the Netherlands under French occupation in 1796, debated the issue for 8 full days, from August 22nd to August 31st, 1796. Or again, the Galician Diet in the Habsburg Empire debated the issue in 1868 for 2 full days. To be sure, Jews were central a century later, at the time of the Dreyfus affair, not to speak of the Vichy regime a century and a half later. We should not, however, make the mistake of reading that centrality back into the French Revolution. To put it concisely, the French Revolution was momentous for the Jews. Jews were not momentous for the French Revolution. Rather than positing or inventing the Jews' centrality, we should instead investigate the Jews' agency. Jews were actively involved in gaining rights. Nothing was given to them on a silver platter or out of sheer necessity for the state. They lobbied and advocated, declaimed and debated in the dogged pursuit of equality. Now today I want to explore that famous debate of December 23, 1789, and show that it in fact emerged by accident. I'll assess the nature of the decree of January 28, 1790, granting equality to the Jews of the Southwest, showing that it was not, in fact, a revolutionary decree. And I'll demonstrate that the decree of September 27, 1791 was about the Constitution, not about the Jews, and was the unfinished business of a lame duck legislature. Finally, I want to highlight throughout that Jewish leaders actively lobbied for their rights. Nothing was given to them without their participation. Now, just one piece of background information. At the time of the French Revolution, there were 4 separate communities of Jews in France. The majority of Jews, perhaps some 20,000, were located in the northeast in Alsace. The second largest community, and those were the Ashkenazic Jews, the second largest community was located in the southwest around the port cities of Bordeaux and Bayonne, and these were Sephardic Jews who had had extensive privileges since the 16th century, having come to France as new Christians or conversos, and whose privileges had been confirmed for them as Jews in 1723. There were approximately 5,000. There were also some 500 to 1,000 Jews in Paris, and then there were Jews in the Papal States. I won't deal with them at all, but I will mention those other 3 communities. Okay, so to begin with the debate of December 23rd, 1789. The revolution in France fashioned a new political culture informed with the ideals of natural rights and equality, the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. In principle, the revolution should have introduced the ideal of equality for Jews by legislating immediate, full citizenship. That was not the case. The legislation of unconditional rights had a troubled career from the start. As the National Assembly struggled to define the nation and citizenship, the Jews' status defied an easy solution. The Assembly, in fact, introduced two types of citizenship. Passive citizenship denoted civic rights based on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the right of residence, jus soli. Active citizenship denoted political rights, which were on a scale graded according to taxation. And of course, political rights were based on property. You had to be a property holder. Both forms of citizenship were in question for the Jews of the Northeast, and at crucial moments, the deputies blurred the distinction between them. For the Jews of Bordeaux, because of their historic privileges, the debate concerned only active citizenship or political rights. On the 26th of August, 1789, the National Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Jews of Paris immediately petitioned the Assembly, asking it to announce that the Declaration applied to Jews without qualifications, giving them passive or civil rights, since, quote, the title of man guarantees us that of citizen, and the title of citizen gives us all the rights of the city, close quote. At the same time, the petitioners renounced all claims to corporate autonomy, announcing their desire, quote, to submit like all the French to the same law, the same order, the same courts, end of quote. Occupied with more pressing matters, the National Assembly did not respond to this request. The now famous debate of December 23, 1789 on the Jews' status occurred accidentally. On December 21st, some deputies asked whether the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen applied to Protestants. The delegates to the Assembly then debated whether the Declaration applied to such proscribed professions as actors and executioners. The deputies blundered onto the Jews' status when, in response to the motion that no one be excluded from active citizenship on account of religion or profession, a delegate from Colmar in Alsace, Rubel, and he'll come up again, queried whether the motion included Jews. And the Count Clermont-Tonnerre, and we'll see him once again, the Count Clermont-Tonnerre answered bluntly, yes. In accordance with the motion, the debate of December 23, 1789, officially addressed political rights. Quote, the admission of non-Catholics to all municipal and provincial offices and all civil and military appointments like all other citizens. Clermont-Tonnerre seemed to adhere to this narrow agenda in his opening speech. He argued from principle. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen established the criteria of citizenship. Neither profession nor religion could render someone ineligible for active citizenship. The executioner acts according to the law. The actor has royal sponsorship. As for religion, the state's law is indifferent to it. Judaism is not an obstacle. The Jews are perfectly capable of being citizens. Quote, the most serious accusations against them are unjust. The others are specious. End of quote. The Jews must renounce their corporate privileges and submit to France's one law. And now I'm going to read a long quotation from Clermont-Tonnerre's famous speech, which I subject you to because there are two versions of Clermont-Tonnerre's speech which are in circulation. One was the account that a journalist made of the speech, and which has become the standard text for virtually all Jewish historians, and which leaves out important passages. The other text is what appears in Clermont-Tonnerre's speech as officially published by the National Assembly, and then also appears in the authoritative Archive Parlementaire. So here we go. But they say to me the Jews have their own judges and laws. I respond that this is your fault, talking to his fellow delegates in the National Assembly, and you should not allow it. We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to Jews as individuals. Now here come the sentences that are lost in that journalist's version. We must withdraw recognition from their judges. They should only have our judges. We must refuse legal protection to the maintenance of the so-called laws of their Judaic organization. They should not be allowed to form in the state either a political body or an order. They must be citizens individually. Okay, so all those sentences about the corporate status of the Jews are what has disappeared from that journalist's account. But some will say to me, they do not want to be citizens. Well then, if they do not want to be citizens, they should say so, and then we should banish them. In short, sirs, the presumed status of every man resident in the country is to be a citizen. In contrast to Clermont-Tonnerre, the deputies who opposed the motion deliberately erased the distinction between active and passive citizenship. They denied the Jews eligibility for both forms. The Abbé Maury from Alsace gainsaid citizenship to executioners because they, quote, assassinate in cold blood. Actors, since removed from paternal authority, they are immoral. As a separate nation, the Jews merit toleration and protection, but are incapable of being citizens. And here I'll read a quotation from Abbé Maury, which is very revealing. The word Jew is not the name of a sect, but of a nation that has laws which it has always followed and still wishes to follow. Calling Jews citizens would be like saying that without letters of naturalization and without ceasing to be English and Danish, the English and Danish could become French. They should not be persecuted. And it's interesting to hear his language here because he'll speak the language of the revolution and of rights, but flip its implications. They should not be persecuted. They are men. They are our brothers, and a curse on whomever would speak of intolerance. No one can be disturbed for his religious opinions. You have recognized this, and from that moment on, you have assured Jews the most extended protection. Let them be protected, therefore, as individuals and not as French, for they cannot be citizens. Protestants, in contrast, for the Abbé Maury, qualify for citizenship on the basis of the Edict of 1787. Louis XVI had issued an Edict of Toleration for the French, giving them civil status, following on the model of Joseph II edicts for the Protestants and the Greek Orthodox in the Habsburg Empire, and Joseph II, of course, was his brother-in-law. Adrien Duport's attempt to bring an alternative motion on December 23, 1789, to grant active and passive rights to all Frenchmen, Jews included, failed to pass by 5 votes. On December 24th, the next day, the deputies resumed consideration of the original motion. The Assembly passed that motion, yet significantly added an amendment specifying that it did not apply to the Jews, quote, without intending to prejudge anything concerning the Jews on whose fate the Assembly would decree. Jews were then explicitly excluded from political rights until some future deliberation. What about civic rights? At best, that status remained unresolved, with the advocates such as Clermont-Tonnerre, but also Mirabeau and the Abbé Grégoire, convinced that in the face of such vehement opposition, it was better to postpone the issue. Okay, now we come to the second event, the National Assembly's vote of January 28, 1790. The Assembly's failure to determine the Jews' status propelled the various Jewish delegations into concerted action. 8 delegates from Bordeaux met numerous times with their Ashkenazi brethren from Alsace, yet only in late January found their positions to be irreconcilable. The Alsatians wanted economic equality and juridical autonomy. They were willing to forego active citizenship. The Bordelais wanted full citizenship on the basis of their corporate privileges. The deputations were aware of the perils of breaking ranks, yet also the manifest advantage that one community's attaining citizenship would bring to the other. The Bordelaise mount, and I should say here that if you read the accounts of nationalist historians, beginning with Dubnov, this is the great act of disloyalty, where the Sephardim abandoned the Ashkenazim. It wasn't the case. The Sephardim were perfectly aware that if they got rights, the Ashkenazim would eventually get rights as well, and the Sephardim continued to lobby behind the scenes on behalf of the Ashkenazim. The Bordelaise mounted a campaign on their own behalf among the deputies in Paris. The delegates argued that the Bordeaux Jews were, quote, naturalized Frenchmen enjoying, quote, all the rights of citizens Regnicole since 1550. They neither lived under a separate regime, quote, neither laws, nor courts, nor separate officers, nor behaved any differently than their fellow citizens. They had participated fully in the political life of Bordeaux, including serving in the militia. Why should they be, quote, the only citizens denied their civil and political rights? The Bordeaux delegates' lobbying succeeded. By January 27th, Talleyrand, the Bishop of Autun, who headed the National Assembly's Constitutional Committee, was prepared to bring a motion on their behalf. The Bordeaux deputies emphasized their privileges and the fact that these had been renewed, quote, renewed by reign after reign. And this is a very important phrase. They thereby established the terms of the National Assembly's debate and motion. Talleyrand took over their language verbatim, the petition that they had submitted. Speaking on behalf of the Constitutional Committee on January 28, 1790, Talleyrand recapitulated the arguments the Bordeaux deputies had presented. He stressed that they were already citizens, quote, by virtue of their lettres patentes, legally registered and renewed from reign to reign. He moved that their citizenship be confirmed and that they be made active citizens. The Abbé Maury objected to the motion on the grounds that, once passed, it would be extended to the Jews of Alsace. He proposed that the Jews of Bordeaux simply be confirmed in the rights that they enjoyed by virtue of their lettres patentes. Clermont-Tonnerre attacked the Assembly's action as a violation of principle, transgressing the uniformity of liberty by establishing two standards. Quote, are your decrees founded on eternal and immutable principles or on privileges to be obtained by some group? He nevertheless hoped for the principle's ultimate triumph. Quote, the Jews of Alsace will be citizens since they are men and French, and because you have decreed that every Frenchman is a citizen when he swears the civic oath and fulfills the conditions of the law. So Clermont-Tonnerre objected on the basis of principle. He said, how can you award one group and not the other? Either this is universal or it's not. Some deputies asked that the motion be deferred because of the late hour. Amid the general clamor, other deputies proposed amendments causing much confusion. Those in favor prevailed, and the motion was passed by 374 votes to 224 votes. And here's the motion. It has two sentences. Listen to the difference between these two sentences. The National Assembly decrees that all of the Jews known in France under the name of Portuguese, Spanish, and Avignonese Jews shall continue to enjoy the rights they have hitherto enjoyed and which have been granted to them by lettres patentes. Okay, so that's a confirmation of their old ancien regime corporate privileges. In consequence thereof, they shall enjoy the rights of active citizens if they possess the other qualifications required by the decrees of the National Assembly. In form and content, this was decidedly not a revolutionary decree. Rather, it was a renewal and extension of corporate privileges. That was the reason for Clermont-Tonnerre's vehement objection. In the Ancien regime, corporations approached each new monarch to request the renewal of existing privileges and the extension of new ones. The Bordeaux deputies had noticed that practice. renewed by reign after reign. The National Assembly opted to follow it, proceeding as if it were a new sovereign, renewing and extending privileges in outright opposition to the abolition of corporations. As a renewal of existing privileges, the Assembly confirmed civic rights or passive citizenship. As the extension of a new privilege, it granted political rights or active citizenship. The Jews of Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Avignon had attained rights at a moment of revolutionary upheaval, although not through a revolutionary act. The Jews of the Southwest thus experienced a seamless transition from their extensive privileges, which had been virtually tantamount to civic rights, to political rights and full citizenship. They attained political rights by campaigning on their own behalf. Moreover, the Sephardic Jews understood themselves as paving the way for citizenship for all Jews. The Abbé Maury had good reason to be apprehensive. Okay, now we come to the third event, which was the National Assembly's vote on September 28, 1791. The 18 months that elapsed before the Jews of the Northeast gained full citizenship were filled with frenzied advocacy in Paris, the headquarters of the revolution. Indeed, on January 28, 1790, prior to the vote in the National Assembly, Jacques Godard, a lawyer and member of the Commune, and Zalkind Horvitz, originally a Jew from Poland who had was one of the three winners of the Metz essay contest on how to make Jews useful, and who had recently been appointed royal librarian for Oriental books. Wearing his uniform as a guardsman, Godard and Horvitz visited the Paris Commune to present the case for equality. The next day, the Paris Commune voted unanimously in favor of active citizenship for the Jews of Paris and sent that decision to the other Parisian districts and the National Assembly. Godard, Horvitz, and others spent most of February visiting the Paris districts. The result was that all districts that reported, save one, supported admission of the Jews to citizenship. On February 25th, the deputation from the Commune visited the National Assembly. Despite this successful lobbying, the National Assembly again deferred the issue. That was a fateful decision, since subsequently the Assembly would be far more divided and preoccupied. The Jews of Paris continued to send requests to the National Assembly, and the Commune of Paris continued to intervene with the National Assembly. Deputies in the National Assembly raised the question of the Jews' status almost monthly, only to have the Abbé Maury, Rubel, and other opponents from Alsace stymie it. Despite these repeated setbacks, the Paris Commune's tenacious lobbying of the National Assembly played a critical role in ultimately obtaining a positive vote. It was under a set of entirely changed circumstances, however, that the National Assembly finally voted on rights for the Jews of Paris and the Northeast. The conflict over the civil constitution of the clergy in July 1790 had radicalized the revolution by introducing an irreconcilable conflict over the church's status. That was also an accidental conflict. It had to do less with the content of the civil constitution and more with the way that it was decided to implement it, because people couldn't take oaths with reservations, the clergy. The National Assembly had dissolved the remaining corporate structures, including titles of hereditary nobility, June 19, 1790, and guilds, masterships, and privileged manufacturers, March 2, 1791, and had abolished a specifically onerous tax, also a form of privilege, on the Jews of Metz. Moreover, the National Assembly had concluded its major business in approving the new Constitution on September 3, 1791. It was set to adjourn so that on October 1, 1791, the new Constituent Assembly, which had already been elected, could convene. With his motion of September 27, 1791, just a few days before the National Assembly was set to dissolve, Adrien Duport aimed to induce a lame duck legislature to complete a piece of unfinished business. The new Constitution had definitively established the criteria for citizenship. How could one continue to defer a decision on the Jews? He declaimed, I believe that liberty of religion no longer permits any distinction about the political rights of citizens by reason of their belief. The question of political existence has been adjourned. Therefore, Turks, Muslims, men of all sects are admitted to political rights in France. I request that the postponement of the Jews' rights be revoked, and in consequence, it be decreed that the Jews in France enjoy active political rights. Roussel, a deputy from Alsace, immediately opposed the motion. It was, however, Regnault's defense of Duport's motion that clinched the matter. He said, I request that all those who speak against this motion be called to order, since they are attacking the Constitution itself. Duport and Regnault thus succeeded in casting the issue as a question of the Constitution's integrity. This was in stark contrast to the debate on December 23, 1789, when the deputies had failed to make that vote about the integrity of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, the motion's significance was evident in its tortured wording. The first paragraph addressed the fundamental ambiguity of the Jews of the Northeast status by admitting them to passive and active citizenship. I quote, "The National Assembly, considering that the Constitution establishes the conditions requisite to be a French citizen and to become an active citizen, and that every man who, being duly qualified, swears the civic oath and engages to fulfill all the duties the Constitution prescribes, has a right to all the advantages it ensures." The second paragraph abrogated all prior privileges granted during the Ancien regime. This motion annuls all postponements, restrictions, and exceptions contained in the preceding decrees affecting individual Jews who shall take the civic oath, which will be regarded as a renunciation of all privileges and exceptions previously introduced in their favor. This motion thus constituted a radical break with the past. In contrast to the Jews of Bordeaux's seamless transition, here was a true rupture that entailed the repeal of a century and a half of legislation. The 18-month delay in granting citizenship to the Jews of Paris and the Northeast fundamentally redefined its meaning. Had the National Assembly voted citizenship in December 1789, alongside Protestants, actors, and executioners, it would have been an enthusiastic ratification of the ideals of equality and humanity. Instead, the vote on September 27, 1791, highlighted constitutional coherence as the decisive factor, withholding rights threatened to vitiate the Constitution. Yet, Duport's motion did not end the matter. The next day, September 28, 1791, Roussel, the relentless and wily adversary, proposed a motion to address the dangers the Jews' citizenship posed to Alsace. He requested legislation that would ensure the equitable resolution of debts owed to Jewish creditors. The legislation required that within 1 month, Jews provide the government with detailed lists of their loans. Government officials would then determine fair terms of repayment. This legislation fundamentally compromised the Jews' equality. It imputed guilt without proof. It regarded the Jews as a singular group engaged in exploitative behavior. On those grounds, it subjected them to special government supervision. This qualification of citizenship boded ill for the future. It indeed passed. Napoleon would enact harsher legislation to address the same issue in 1808. Now, what's interesting is that the law passed, but because this was a lame duck legislature, it was a dead letter. No one ever paid any attention to it. The French Revolution's alteration of the Jews' political status was truly fundamental, although so were its ambiguities. The National Assembly's legislation did not have an unalloyed revolutionary pedigree. The Ancien regime persisted in both form and content. Nevertheless, in a Europe polarized by the Revolution, full emancipation or equal rights would be irrevocably associated with the ideas of 1789. When and where those ideas triumphed, so did Jewish emancipation. When and where opponents triumphed, Jewish emancipation suffered either abridgment or outright abrogation. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Be delighted.
David will be taking questions.
Maud has the first question. I can see it coming.
So I'm curious a little bit about the historiographical implications of the argument because, trained as a modern Jewish historian out of a generation that really followed, in some ways, yours, in terms of really kind of thinking of the French case, not just the French case, of nation states as very kind of separate stories in Jewish assimilation and emancipation. I sense that you're gesturing more towards a more integrated European story. I understand this is a French story, but really saying that maybe we went too far in our thinking of sort of three wings of Jewish emancipation: Eastern European, Central European, and Western European, and that actually the tensions and ambiguities of the French case were more similar in some ways to things that happened in other places, although distinctive. Is that right? Would I follow?
Yes and no. I'm certainly trying to highlight the ambiguities and contingencies of the French case because, there has been a scholarship, and I think here of Reinhard Rurup's important 1969 article on Jewish emancipation in bourgeois society, in which he totally ignores Eastern Europe. Emancipation never happened there right until 1917, which isn't the case. But he sets up a contrast between the French revolutionary model of a single edict which gives Jews emancipation unconditionally as compared to a Central European etatist enlightened model in which the Jews are given incremental emancipation, incremental conditional emancipation, conditional on their regeneration, a kind of ongoing quid pro quo. Or if you look, for example, at Pierre Birnbaum in that volume that he edited on Paths to Emancipation, he basically assumes, like Rurup, that emancipation ends in 1791 and that's it. And so what I'm trying to show, first of all, is that the this revolutionary process is actually far less revolutionary than it seemed. Especially in the case of the Sephardic Jews, but even for the Jews of Alsace, it really is this kind of piece of unfinished business that's significant for the Jews, but not at all significant for the revolution. On the other hand, I would argue that the French case does fit, not neatly, rather messily, into a tripartite scheme of emancipation across Europe. I would argue that the Western European experience, in which I would include Holland, England, and the Jews of the Southwest, but also the British colonies, Jamaica, Canada, the United States, the early Republic, was a pattern in which Jews had already gained civic rights, either through the terms of resettlement or over time in kind of an ad hoc process, and then had to struggle for political rights. Right. So here's the example of the Sephardic Jews of Bordeaux having to struggle for political rights, and based on the confirmation of their civic rights. Whereas in addition, what's important is to see that that's a pattern of emancipation out of estates, right? Jews in England never had a charter, were never part of estates. Jews in Holland, particularly Amsterdam, never had a charter, were already parts of a kind of nascent civil society. It's also true in the American colonies as well. The Central European pattern is one of a protracted emancipation process which turns on both civic and political rights, but in addition has two other layers of ambiguity. It's a process in which there are two competing models of emancipation into estates. That begins with Joseph II's legislation when he opens up occupations to the Jews, and particularly the guilds, opens up education. But at the same time, there's also, in some cases, a pattern of out-of-estates, and those two patterns conflict or compete throughout the 19th century, are only resolved in 1870. In addition, in Central Europe, you have a kind of singular competition between two levels of law, where you have local rights, in German Heimatrecht, and then you have local citizenship and state citizenship. And those two compete because corporations continue in Central Europe down to 1870. You know, in many of what Mac Walker calls German hometowns, citizenship rights are still in the hands of the guilds until 1870, right? So you have two competing, and you can be given, in some states, Jews get state citizenship, but they can't get local citizenship. So state citizenship doesn't mean much if you have no place to live. Or in some cases, it's the reverse. Okay, and then in Eastern Europe, the situation is, Tsarist policy tends to follow the policy of the Habsburg Empire and Prussia, except so emancipation, the scope of emancipation is broad, concerning both civic and political rights. But in Tsarist Russia, the pattern is always into estates, because the estates are very different kinds of institutions. They're not the continuation of medieval and early modern corporations. The estates were introduced by Catherine II in the 1780s in order to organize the population for the utility of the state. So those estates, the soslovy and the table of ranks, will continue until 1917, even though they get progressively more ambiguous. So, does that answer? Please.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. This is too much of a revolutionary question, but talk more about the winter of '89-90 and why, both why the decision was made to use the. Sorry, am I not speaking up enough? You're stuck. So
I'm stuck. Okay, I can only come so far.
I can come to you if you
No, that's okay. I can come around.
So, if you could talk more about why the decision was made to use the mechanism of privilege, how unusual that was. I mean, certainly as a French historian, it comes as something of a surprise to me that was the mechanism that was used after August, and it seems anachronistic. So, was it anachronistic, or was there a history in later '89 and '90 of continuing to kind of renew and create new privileges even after August?
Yeah, that's a really good. Could everyone hear the question? Okay. I think it was anachronistic. I should know the events of that winter better. I think it's singular, though I'm not positive. And I think it's I think the Bordeaux Jews realized that they had unusual leverage and that they should use it, right? That Jews were not going to be given equality on the basis of principle, and that they had the leverage of their privileges. And that if they could convince, and particularly Talleyrand and the Constitutional Committee, to buy that argument, that they could in fact gain equality. So they not only submitted a petition to Talleyrand, given who Talleyrand was and the way the kind of political animal was, you know, he was probably if he wasn't the most corrupt politician of the French Revolution, he certainly was near the top, right? So they probably bribed him, right? But you know, bribery was a legitimate political tool in the 18th century. Probably a legitimate political tool in this current election in the United States as well. It'll come out later. And it was also an established tool of Jewish intercession, of Stadlanut, you know. The tools of intercession were first to go and beg, then to present presents. You know, when Maria Theresa expelled the Jews from Prague in 1744, one of the first things the local intercessors from Prague did was to bring Maria Theresa a huge salmon. You know? Now, once that failed, you know, if begging didn't work, if presents didn't work, then you presented your charters and made a legal argument. And if all that failed, then you tried bribery. And if that failed, then you cried. Right? Those were the tools of the intercessor of the Stadlan. So it wouldn't be unusual for them to have bribed Talleyrand and maybe other members of the Constitutional Committee as well. I mean, Mirabeau, maybe Mirabeau was more corrupt than Talleyrand, I don't know. Talleyrand was certainly much wealthier, being a cardinal, and you know.
Did nobody object in the assembly to the use of specifically to the use of privilege?
Well, Clermont-Tonnerre objected, and there were other people who objected. I didn't quote them, but they objected as well. They said, you know, this is a violation of principle, but nonetheless, the vote went in favor. So it is anachronistic, but you know, it's also a case where through lobbying and through submitting a very carefully and thoughtfully worded petition, they were able to frame the terms of the debate, right? And that worked, right? And I think that hasn't been sufficiently recognized by Jewish historians. I mean, there's this wonderful, you know, it's not as if I found something here in the archives. There's a wonderful 8-volume set of documents that was issued in 1968 on the French Revolution. And there's a whole volume on this vote the vote in January of 1790. And all I did was to sit there and read through the volume and read the documents carefully. It's all there in print, you know. Please.
These two groups that you mentioned, the Jews of Alsace and the Jews in Bordeaux, they seem so monolithic, you know, were there not Jews in other parts of France that lobbied on behalf of the emancipation?
Well, there were the Jews of Paris who were lobbying, right? And yes, well, you know, I mean, for the purposes of the paper, I treat them monolithically. There were some there were differences within those groups, but if you look at the petitions that were submitted by the Jewish leaders, they presented their positions as being monolithic. You know, they don't present dissent. I mean, there were differences between the Jews of Bordeaux and the Jews of Alsace, but not internally. Obviously, there were differences of opinion, but those don't appear in the actual petitions and in the actual lobbying. Okay, I mean, and look, of course, in these petitions, we're reading the thoughts of Jewish leaders who, by and large, came from who were the elites of the community, who were pursuing their own interests, who weren't necessarily mindful of the interests of all of the Jews they represented, especially the lower classes. The Bordeaux representatives were elected. There was an election process. The representatives from Alsace were not elected. Those communities were run oligarchically, and the representatives were chose oligarchically. There were leading families who maintained control of the communities, who passed on leading positions in the community from one generation to the next. Maud, let's have another go.
I actually have a follow-up to that, because I was struck by what you said about the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim and how the Sephardim knew that they were advocating or would advocate on behalf of the Ashkenazim afterwards, which seems to contradict a little bit what you were just saying there about sort of a sense of self-representation or representing the larger group. But my question really is, why do you think we have a different, like what is the source difference that has led prior historians to make a distinction and argue that the Sephardim were in it for themselves and the Ashkenazim were, that they were at odds? Because that's certainly how I've always taught it and learned it myself, but I'm not sure now when I think about it why I know what I know.
Yeah, well, you know what you know because that has been the standard line since Dubnov wrote about it at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. That is the conventional wisdom of nationalist historians. Okay, and Dubnov was not a Zionist, he was an autonomist. He was in favor of diaspora Jewish nationalism. But he thought emancipation in the West, the emancipation of individuals, had been a disaster because it had led to assimilation. And what he wanted as part of, which was part of this re-envisioning of the multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-confessional empires of East Central Europe and Eastern Europe, of the Habsburg Empire in Russia, where thinkers at the end of the 19th century, Renner and Bauer and others, began to think of, rather than of a central state, as a federation of national groups enjoying autonomy in language, education, perhaps even having national assemblies and rights of taxation. Dubnov thought that emancipation in the West, the emancipation of individuals, had not just been insufficient, but had been a disaster for the Jews, which he wanted to prevent in Eastern Europe by having Jews in Eastern Europe attain civic rights and national minority rights at the same time. So that's the line, and so that view, the late Jonathan Frankel wrote about this as sort of the East European Jewish school of historiography. That view was taken over by all the nationalist historians, autonomists, Zionists, socialist Zionists, etc.
The argument would be that the Bordeaux Jews, by being as assimilationist as they were, turned their back on their brethren.
Precisely. They were the assimilationists, and therefore they acted entirely in their own interest and betrayed Jewish solidarity, which led to these terrible consequences. Now, I haven't, it's Gerard Nahon who has a number of articles on this where he's discovered all sorts of continuing correspondence and meetings between the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim after January of 1790. And presents a totally different view of it. Now, again, he's, you could say, well, he's sort of an apologist for the Sephardic Jews, and in some of his scholarship, I think there's some truth to that, but the evidence he presents is so overwhelming that I find it persuasive. Please.
So on that note, to what extent are the Sephardi Jews in France operating in isolation from other Sephardic communities, whether it's London or Amsterdam? And to what extent do we need to broaden the picture?
Oh, at that point, you mean, are they in touch with Jews elsewhere?
And might Dubnov sort of be picking up on sort of the legacy of Sephardi sort of superiority vis-a-vis Ashkenazi?
Well, I hadn't thought about that, but that could very well play a role. That the Sephardic Jews in early modern Europe saw themselves as the nobility of European Jewry, and in many of the communities where you had mixed populations of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, Amsterdam and London, for example, if a member of a Sephardi Jew married an Ashkenazi Jew, that was seen as worse than marrying a Christian, right? Which was then, of course, reversed in places like New York in the 19th and 20th century, where Ashkenazi Jews thought the same thing. Were they in touch with Jews, Sephardi Jews? Not at this point. As far as I know, I've never actually thought about that. When they are, well, that's not. As far as I know, and I wouldn't say this is absolutely true, I'm not sure. I think this is really an internal French matter. It unfolds so quickly and so dramatically, particularly the December 23rd debate and then the vote in January, that I don't know if there's there's a scholar in Paris who would know that. Yveline Oliel-Graus would know this. She's really worked through all that archival material. It's worth asking her. When the Jews in France are in touch with Jews throughout Europe is in 1806 to 1808 with the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin, when they're asked to respond to this series of 12 questions concerning issues such as polygamy, divorce, the power of the rabbis, the attitude of Jews towards non-Jews, et cetera, and the relationship, especially the relationship between Jewish law and civil law. Now there, at that point, the major rabbi who's at the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin, David Sinsheim, is in touch with rabbinical authorities throughout Europe, and there's an enormous, there is a correspondence where he wants, he's having to convince the lay members of the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin to act in accord with Jewish law, with halakha. At the same time, he wants the imprimatur, the hechsher, of rabbinical authorities throughout Europe, and he corresponds with rabbinical authorities throughout Europe. And there's a wonderful older article by a scholar named Tuati, who's worked through all that material, and he shows that Sinsheim actually does get the backing of rabbinical authorities, because to go back to this earlier conversation, historians since Dubnov, but for many generations, have argued, that these Jews basically sold out Judaism in order to become French citizens. And that really doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, you can argue just the opposite, that what Sinsheim was doing was engaging in an act of principled resistance, because Napoleon at that point wanted the Jews to submit to the centralized imperial state, just the way the Catholics had with the Concordat and the Protestants with the creation of the Consistoire, the Protestant consistory. And that in fact Sinsheim refuses to do that, because the key decision is on the question of marriage. Will Jewish authorities recognize marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? And the answer is, certainly in civil law, that marriage will be valid. But then there's this wonderful quotation, I can't quote it quite verbatim, but a Jewish rabbi is no happier recognizing a marriage between a Christian and a Jew than a Catholic priest. And therefore, an intermarriage will have no sanction in Jewish law. Now, what's also interesting, and is in the published documents, I didn't find this in the archives, is that Napoleon, when he called the Assembly of Notables to deal with those issues of marriage and divorce, he actually wanted to write a law, or to write into law, that every third Jewish marriage would have to be an intermarriage, a marriage with a Christian. And somewhere along the way, his ministers got rid of that.
Was he married 3 times?
I'm sorry?
Was he married 3 times?
Was he married 3 times? Twice. Please.
I'm just, I don't come from a position terribly familiar with material, but recapitulating in my head what you've been talking about for the last hour. And I guess the picture that I'm getting is there's a real irony here in how emancipation happened for these two communities that you discussed, and that one is seeking to get it in an assimilationist vein, but actually gets a head start on it because it's able to leverage its corporate privileges, which is the opposite of the way they wanted it, while the other community is actually desperately seeking to protect its own insular corporatism and wins emancipation a year and a half later, precisely in the opposite way, by some extension of a civic assimilationism.
That's right.
So both of them get what they want, and they actually, each of them gets it. Both of them wanted the same thing, wanted it in a completely different way, and each of those communities got it in the way the other one wanted, and not in the way that they had designed for themselves to be achieving the status.
Well, yeah, it's a wonderful irony or a paradox, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. I'll think that. I'll have to think on that one. But yes, that's right, because the Jews from Alsace wanted to retain a certain kind of communal autonomy, particularly their courts, which of course they weren't allowed to do. And the Jews of Bordeaux were very proud of their corporate privileges, but wanted to give them up and just become part of the Bordeaux community, which, in fact, they did do.
But thanks to their corporate privileges.
But thanks to their corporate privileges. So, and you can see this if you look at the if you look at one of the most important delegates from Bordeaux, Abraham Furtado, you can actually sort of trace that political odyssey, because in the early part of the revolution, he's actually kind of a follower of Rousseau, and is vehemently in favor of creating a unified democratic France. And he's elected to he's elected to the Estates General from Bordeaux, and he plays a role in the early revolution in Bordeaux. He's on the municipal council. And then the terror turns him around. And from being an adherent of Rousseau, he becomes an adherent of Locke and Montesquieu, and becomes more attentive to history and historical rights. But then he becomes a member. He's elected to the Assembly of Notables, and he becomes is elected president of the Assembly of Notables, and he has to work with someone like David Sinsheim, and he's actually something of a deist. He's still a Jew, but in a very tepid way. So it's a very even the odysseys of individuals in the period are very poignant.
If there's no more questions, then we'd like to thank David very much for a stimulating lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.